Hello everyone, I am going to present my paper Identifying Climate Adjacency, finding from 4 case studies. This work was sponsored by Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies and was done by me and my partner Kabir Sharma at Testa Research LLP. You can read more about this work in the full report that is put up on our website. The purpose and scope of this work was to identify climate linkages in non-climate focused projects, how social and environmental projects have a linkage with climate. We had to assess the project activities' interactions with adaptation and mitigation. To also make participants, which is the agencies, aware about such linkages that exist and to initiate the process of documenting climate linkages within non-climate focused projects. These are the images of the various places, the different ecosystems where we conducted the research and the case studies. We developed 4 case studies in rainforest ecosystems, mangroves, community conserved areas, and sacred groves. The method we applied was we did participatory systems thinking workshops with these agencies who are managing these projects. We understood the historical dynamics and developed behavior over time graphs of key indicators of their project. We asked them to present these BOTGs back to us. We listened to their BOTGs and the narration of how the dynamics have changed in the past. And by listening to those stories, we started developing causal loop diagrams and then showed those causal loop diagrams back to the participants for verification and refinement. And through that, we started developing system stories that depict the dynamics of maladaptation, mitigation, and ecosystems-based adaptation. In addition to this, we had also developed adaptation matrix and mitigation matrix to identify a one-to-one impact of each project activity on the adaptive capacity of people, the local ecosystems, and emissions. We used the Iceberg Framework to develop our overall process. We started with what is it that we want to study. We wanted to look at the climate linkages of non-climate focused projects. We believe that climate change is often separated from development interventions and is often seen in silo. We started with patterns. We started with the key dynamics of change of the indicators of the projects that these agencies were running, how the situation has evolved, where it has reached today, and what were the key turning points in the history of the system. And that gave us a good context about their work and why they are doing what they are doing. And by listening to these dynamics over time, we started identifying feedback loops which are producing these dynamics and developed causal loop diagrams. These diagrams then told us much more than just what the program was about. And through that, we were able to start a discussion on adaptive capacity, local ecosystems, and emissions and mitigation. Did this whole exercise lead to a shift in the mindset of the participants or on the mental models? We don't know if it has led to a shift, but we certainly know that it led to verification or testing of people's assumptions about their own program theory and how their programs interacts with climate, both adaptation and mitigation. So there was a fair amount of iterations, group discussions, challenges thrown amongst the team. So we do believe that it had some impact on the mental models. What that impact exactly is and what shift it led to is rather hard to know at this moment. Let's look at some of the structured behavior outcomes that our workshops have produced. The first case is on pastoralism. This is one BOTG that the participants had made, and the indicator identified was pastoral income. How the pastoral income has changed. We had asked participants to choose their own time frames that they're comfortable with, that they have a reference for, how far back in time they would like to go. And then we established a scale-based indicator from minimum to maximum. And then people started plotting in groups. They started plotting the historical dynamics of change. Here we see that it all started with dairy being introduced into the landscape, and that increased the dairy-based income. And then there was an earthquake that local system faced in 2000, after which additional funds were put into the livelihood development, again mainly through dairy. And then the milk pricing was changed to look at what is the fat content in the milk and so on and so forth. And that's how the pastoral income really started going up, mainly through dairy. And the hope for future is that it will continue to go up. Another indicator that we plotted was on camels. These are special breeds of camels that we find on the coast. These camels can swim in water. But as you see in this BOTG, they have shown that the population of camels has really come down in the last 10 to 20 years. It's mainly because a decrease in common grazing grounds, loss of mangroves, and industrialization, land conversion. The hope is that potentially they can increase the camel population by doing some project interventions like bringing in dairy for camel, which is a little difficult and different as compared to buffaloes and cows, and by doing proper conservation, breed management. We heard all this and much more in the workshop and started developing such feedback loops. So one of the things we identified was there is a policy impact on livestock composition and breed, where there is a bent of policies away from genetically aligned incentives. So you're not necessarily incentivized to conserve a breed. On the contrary, there's a policy push like dairy introduction through formal channels, which actually incentivizes a change in the livestock composition. And then the dominance of livestock moves towards those species that can produce more milk, and especially the fat content in the milk should go up. That changes the livestock composition, which is not necessarily good for the local biodiversity and the genetic diversity of the breeds. There's also a loss of pastoral mobility. Pastoralists would move around the country in different states for searching for grazing land. And that is also eroded because the traditional forms of pastoralism are changing now. There's more of sedentarization. They choose to live at a place which is closer in proximity to the dairies. And that changes their nomadic forms of pastoralism, which is a big thing when we talk about the adaptive capacities, especially to changing weather patterns within a year. Another BOTG that they made was on the access to forage and common grazing grounds, which has come down substantially in the last 20 years, which is another reason for changes also in livestock composition, because now you have to stall feed and they're destined to stay at one location and maybe move towards dairy because they don't have grounds to go around grazing. And the loss of commons we identified was also a loss of culture because culturally the commons and the livestock form a good nexus that allows the communities to live their traditional forms of lives and also conserve the common grounds. But erosion of a commons is actually erosion of a cultural exchange and the loss of livelihood, which again has strong bearings on the adaptive capacity of people for climate change. The next case was on community conserved areas. Here we looked at how the inclusiveness of forest laws and policies for the communities, and the BOTs showed us that there has been a push and pull effect kind of escalation that has happened, and there is a strong feedback from the authorities to pull down the rights of community conserved areas to give them their land rights. One of the main reasons we find here was because there is a strong drive on plantation of trees for improving the sequestration of carbon, which is not necessarily in line with the local biodiversity on which people rely for their livelihoods and for their living, the ecosystem services that their local commons provide. That again reduces their adaptive capacity and in the long run also people's well-being. Uh, Another example was on the awareness part of community conservation, and also the awareness of the role community conservation plays for ecosystems-based adaptation. So we found out that there is a strong linkage between community conservation and climate change adaptation. And we thought that in the discourse for conservation, if you add climate change lens, it can potentially strengthen the argument for community conserved areas and for land rights. We looked at the sacred groves, community managed areas. We realized that traditionally the sacred groves were also managed and used for livelihoods, and that incentivized a conservation loop, which is kind of a reinforcing loop that sustained these sacred groves called as orans in Rajasthan, India. But due to the growth in agriculture, there is a bit of maladaptation happening now because there is a fair amount of encroachment that started happening in the sacred groves. And once there is an encroachment that starts, it leads to an attraction of others also, to motivates them to also encroach, and starts the process of some reinforcing loops that leads to more and more maladaptation happening in the orans and encroachment happening in the orans. Because once the sacred groves start declining, then their ability to provide ecosystem services such as water and nutrients and soil nutrient regulation also comes down. That makes the land outside orans less fertile, and then more people are driven to do agriculture inside the orans. Similarly, there are climate and non-climate drivers which are impacting the orans and common areas, which is mainly to do with weather, milk prices, promotion of dairy, cattle, and the collection centers, which is changing the livestock composition and which is changing the biodiversity of that local landscape and the vegetation mix. The last case study here is on the coexistence of human-wildlife populations. This is a case of human deaths due to elephants, and this BOTG showed us that the human deaths due to elephants has actually come down after the project interventions, whereas the rainforest restoration or the number of protected fragments has actually gone up, and the hope is that it can further be restored and increased. We realized that rainforest restoration and coexistence of human wildlife goes hand in hand. You cannot achieve one without achieving the other. And also the role that community engagement plays for wildlife and rainforest restoration effort is mutually reinforcing. You need to have participatory coexistence measures, and you need to involve the community to understand wildlife and support wildlife and find ways of developing early warning signals, not just using technology but also using human communication. Overall findings from these 4 case studies was that there are significant climate linkages that exist in non-climate focused projects. It is important that we monitor and learn about these climate linkages for us to be able to enhance our climate actions. People do intuitively think about climate, but they don't formally internalize it into their project design, simply because the project is not called a climate focused projects. People have fundamental questions about the assumptions that goes into their program theory, but often don't get the required platform to bring it up. And realize that there is a lot of team learning that happened during the workshop, but we also realize that there is enough learning that happens, but it happens only within the teams. So the individuals and the individual teams are very knowledgeable, but the cross learning between different knowledge streams is rather poor or rather rare. We have come to understand that resilience towards climate change cannot be developed in isolation. Development done without considering climate change can often lead to maladaptation. Mitigation and adaptation cannot be seen as separate goals. There are strong interplays between the two, like we saw in the case of plantation and its impact on adaptive capacities. The likelihood of maladaptation is perhaps the highest when the local system is under stress and when it is integrated with the macro forces. Hence, we can identify maladaptation, but the roots of maladaptation lie much before maladaptation actually happens. So we have to be careful when we look at social fragmentation events taking place in different landscapes and rapid integration with large macro forces, which can change the motivations of people. Ultimately, we believe that enhancing climate change requires 3 things. improved awareness about climate linkages of our own actions, which this research work, 4 workshops, did to some extent. We had to identify ways of countering maladaptation and enhancing proactive adaptation and mitigation, but we cannot do it until and unless we have collaborative networks for leveraging our collective capacities and using tools which allow us to look at things in totality and not in compartments and isolation. And systems thinking definitely is one of those tools that can help us achieve this. Thank you very much, and I will be very happy to take questions now and respond to them. Thank you.